Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Tansey from Silver Sands, and welcome to our webinar on unlocking knowledge with Microsoft Viva Topics and SharePoint Syntex. Today, James will be running you through the mixture of slides and interactive demos to showcase some of the latest and greatest applications and services from Microsoft. As always, we'll be running today's webinar as an interactive session, so please feel free to ask questions throughout, and James and I'll do our best to answer these as we go. We have an hour on the clock, so we'll be holding back approximately 10 minutes at the end for any questions. And I'd now like to welcome James Mallalieu, our Principal Consultant, to kick off the webinar. James, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's session. So my name is James, and over the next 45 minutes, we are going to be talking about Viva Topics and SharePoint Syntex. So a bit of context about the session. The purpose of the session is primarily to introduce Viva Topics and SharePoint Syntex. So we're not intending to do a very technical deep dive on these technologies, but I want to kind of position them, demonstrate and show what they can do and talk about the challenges that they're there to address. I can't escape by not talking about licensing for both of these products because there is a licensing implication, and I'll give you some info about that. And of course, if you've got any questions at all as I go through, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, at the end, we've left a little bit of time for questions. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is Viva Topics, and a common challenge that I'm aware of myself, because I experienced this, and certainly my co-workers and other people I speak to, is how do we find the resources that we need on a day-to-day basis to do our work? Now, I'm not talking here about resources like an employee guide or an expense form. I'm talking about documents and files and information that's relevant for something I am doing at this point in time. So let's say I was putting together this deck, and I'm looking for other decks within the organization that may relate to Viva Topics. Or I might be looking for someone else within the organization who has some understanding of Viva Topics. Now, for a relatively small organization like Silver Sands, this presents some challenges, but when you scale it up to larger organizations, this can be a real significant challenge. And it's always interesting to think about how much time each day you spend looking for a piece of content or looking for an individual that you know probably exists, but you've no idea where it's stored or who the person is you need to speak to. So just to drill into that in a bit more detail, organizations are comprised of people. So whether you're a 25-person organization, 5,000 or 10,000 person organization, people have expertise and they have knowledge. And when I'm looking for a person, typically the department they work within or the job role they have doesn't always help me find the right person that I need to talk to. Now, if I'm looking for resources, and for the context of this session, by resources, we're talking about files and pages that exist in Microsoft 365. So files being PDF files, Word documents, could be Excel workbooks, pages being SharePoint pages. Now, all of that content exists within SharePoint sites. So most organizations, even if you're very small, will have hundreds, if not thousands of SharePoint sites. Larger organizations, we're talking tens of thousands of SharePoint sites. Now, the challenge there is, how do I find the content I'm looking for? Now, you're probably thinking, but surely that's what Microsoft Search is there for, or that's what SharePoint Search is there for. And I'm going to say yes and no. Good as SharePoint or Microsoft Search is, one of the challenges is when I do a search, it gives me very granular results. So if I'm looking for something, I end up with a significant volume of results that I have to then look through and try and find what I want. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now, most organizations have recognized this to be a challenge over the years and built solutions specifically targeted at addressing it. So organizations may have an employee intranet. The primary purpose is to give employees a central location where they can find out information about being an employee for that organization. Or alternatively, they might have built a knowledge base, something maybe for their service desk to use, or a product knowledge base, or a sales knowledge base. Now, these solutions work very well in terms of answering the question of, these are the people that have understanding about this subject, and here is the content that relates to this subject. But they tend to be very narrow in their focus, and they also tend to be costly to design, implement, and maintain. So this is where Viva Topics comes in. And essentially, Viva Topics is comprised of topics, hence the name, I guess. Now, think of a topic as being anything that has meaning to your organization. It could be a location, it could be a product, it could be a service, it could be a process, it could be an initiative, it could be a function, basically anything. Okay, it's not a technical definition, it's just a thing that has meaning, a topic. And essentially what the topics do is signpost people and content within your organization that relates to that topic. Now, the easiest way to show to kind of show this is to demonstrate it in action. So let me just flick over to a demo and give you a quick demonstration of how Viva Topics helps. So I'm looking at the homepage of my intranet, and let's say I'm scrolling down and I've got a couple of news articles which I'm going to read. So this first one, SOAR strategic overview. Now I'm reading this news article and I'm thinking, all very interesting, but I actually have no idea what SOAR is. It's an acronym, I may not be familiar with it, and there's nothing in the article that gives me any context about what SOAR is. Now, conveniently, I'm sitting on my intranet, so I'm going to do a search for SOAR. And this is where the search, the point I highlighted before, can sometimes not satisfy what I need. Because yes, it does return all the content in the organization that relates to SOAR, but it's not really answered my question. I, as a user, have got to search through that and find the content that gives me a bit of background information about what SOAR is, what it means. Okay. Now, if I then say who in my organization knows about SOAR, click on people, I get no results. So I can't find anyone. Now, let me just contrast this. So if I go back to my homepage and I select this news article, and this news article is about another initiative, this time called OR. And in this case, you'll notice that the word OR is underlined. So as I hover over it, I get what's called a topic card that pops up, and it gives me some context about OR. So it tells me, Operational Accountability Review. And it's a regional program which enables Contoso operational staff to create guidelines, blah, 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 blah. And it gives me reference to people who are involved in that initiative and resources that relate to that initiative. Now, just a point here, I'm currently looking at a SharePoint page, but this facility, this ability to have topics, pop-up cards, is available or will be available in Microsoft Teams, in Microsoft Outlook, and in the Word desktop tools. So as you're reading content, where there is content that relates to a topic, you'll get the ability to see these topic cards. Now, from a search point of view, if I didn't use the topic card and I did a search for OR, I still get all of my results. So I still get a whole load of results, that I could sift through should I be interested. But you see what appears right at the top is this topic card that essentially says, if you're looking for OR, then this is a topic known to the organization. Here's our description of what OR is. Here are people involved in it, and here are resources. And then I can click See More, which gives me an expanded view of that topic. So in the expanded view, I have got people who are associated with it. I have got files and pages that have been suggested, and I'll come back to what we mean by suggested in a moment, that relate to this topic. I have got SharePoint sites that potentially contain content that is related to this topic. Now, just a point here, as a user, I will never see any content that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. So if the or sales pitch, which is stored in a SharePoint site called US Sales, was not available to me as the person viewing the page, I would not see a link to that document here. So it respects the security of the underlying content. The same is obviously true for any SharePoint sites. If I didn't have rights to any of these sites, I wouldn't then see the link here. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's kind of interesting, but surely that's going to be a big overhead for us as an organization to maintain and manage all of these topics. And of course, if that's how you would need to do it, I'd agree. But the magic within Viva Topics is how these topics get created. So if I just hop back to my slides, topics get created in one of two ways. So yes, you can manually create topics. You can go in and you can add topics for whatever you want, whatever you feel is a topic. And we'll do that in a moment. But where it truly becomes interesting is AI suggested topics. So essentially, there is a process that reasons over all of your content that exists within your SharePoint sites, all of the files and all of the pages, and it will automatically suggest topics based on the content that is contained within those SharePoint sites. Now you then get the option of whether you want to confirm and publish these before they're visible to end users, or whether you're happy for the AI suggested topics just to be published. Once a topic exists, irrespective of whether it's manually created or AI suggested, then there is another process that pulls together the files and the people that relate to that topic. Okay, so again, let me just show you this in action. So I'm going into an area that the administrator of Viva Topics would have access to. And essentially, we can see here we've got 4 tabs. And the ones we're primarily interested in for the purpose of today is suggested and published. So in suggested, these are all the topics that the AI process has found and suggested based on the content that exists within the SharePoint sites of this environment. Now, my environment here is very small. So, we're talking 20, 30, 50 topics. If you were to set this off in your production live environments, you would have significantly more topics. And it gives me some information about the topics. So it says the quality, and that relates to the amount of content it's found that relates to the topic. Impressions is telling me how often this topic has already been viewed in my environment. So in my environment, I don't have to publish a suggested topic. They automatically will appear. And this gives me some information. So I can click on it, and this tells me a bit about the topic that's being generated, description, the people, so forth. And if we go into this one gives me the information. Now, if I click on this, this is the complete topic page. Now, I just want to reiterate, at this point, there has been no human interaction to get to this stage. So we have a topic name, we have an alternate name, we have a topic description, and the topic description has been pulled from this page, automatically pulled. We have people who are suggested to be associated with this topic, and you can see here it's telling you why it suggested these people, because these people have contributed resources that relate to this topic. If we look at the suggested resources, files and pages, you can see here a collection of Word documents, PowerPoint slide decks, and it gives you an idea of why it suggested it. So it's the topic is mentioned twice in this document, topic mentioned once, and so forth. And then down here we have suggested sites. Okay, so this is the SharePoint sites that contain the files that have been suggested for this topic. So at this point, that topic exists within my environment without any human interaction. So if I did a search for CMV128, I will get a topic card. You see up here it's saying suggested topic. And you see this little note here, Viva Topics has identified this as a topic of interest for your organization. Does that seem right? Now, end users can say, yeah, that seems right. And once you get sufficient volume of that, the topic will increase its relevance within the organization. So if I go back to my topic card, this page can then be enhanced. So people who do have subject matter expertise or knowledge about this topic can kind of go in and say, I'm going to say that this person, Nesta Wyke, is the program manager for the CMV 128. And I'm going to say that document is a really useful document to get a bit of background about this product. That's the data sheet. So essentially what I'm doing is pinning documents. I'm moving them from suggested to being pinned ones. It just gives them a higher priority. But if there's files I want to add that aren't in this list, I can click add here, and I can select files from, well, anywhere in my SharePoint environment that obviously I have rights to. So if I just do a search for Contoso, let's just put that in, click add. Now, the other thing I might want to do is add additional context. So I could add, for instance, an image. So it could be an image of the product. I don't know what the CV182 is, but let's just assume it's a printer of some kind, but let's just say it's a drone. So I can put a picture of a drone, and I could put some other information, you know, whatever I want about this. It could be images, it could be links, it could be documents, it could be a YouTube video about the item, pretty much whatever I want to put. Now think of this a bit like Wikipedia. So Wikipedia allows lots of people to go in and edit the content and improve the quality of the content. But what's important here is none of the content it signposts is being duplicated. This is simply acting as a page that provides these signposts to content that relates to this topic. So I can then click publish, and that will now be published. Okay, so it's entirely feasible that you could let the AI suggest all your topics and leave it as that. But actually, in reality, to get the most out of Viva Topics, you do need some human interaction to help the AI out in topics that it doesn't find. And there are scenarios where it will find a topic that you potentially don't want to expose. So let's say we've got the GR88 and we don't want this topic, we can just remove it, and that will take it out of the out of Viva Topics, and it won't be surfaced. Okay, so let me kind of summarize. So essentially, a topic can relate to anything: animal, vegetable, mineral, whatever you want. It's not a technical thing. It relates to a term, a phrase, an acronym. It's whatever has meaning to your organization. It is there to signpost people and resources. Okay, that is its primary purpose. You can either manually create topics, and/or you can let the AI suggest topics, and you can decide what level of governance you want in terms of when topics become visible to the wider organization. Topics themselves surface either in search as topic cards, as you've seen. They surface in SharePoint pages, and they will start surfacing in Teams posts, in Outlook emails, and in Office documents as you're reading them. So hopefully that gives you a kind of, I appreciate, albeit very quick, just a summary of Viva Topics. So if we move on and think a little bit about SharePoint Syntex. Now, at first, this seems like it's solving a different problem. So once I've covered a bit to do with SharePoint Syntex, I'm going to come back to how Viva Topics and SharePoint Syntex work together. But for the moment, let's think about the problems that we're trying to solve with SharePoint Syntex. Organizations need to classify content. So I'm referring here typically to pages. And by classify, what I'm essentially saying is that a piece of content needs to be classified to allow you to apply an appropriate governance process to it, be it retention or be it information protection. It may need to be classified with metadata to allow you to support a business process. And these two things have been available for kind of time immortal with SharePoint. But it's how you get that information captured for documents that's interesting. So if I go across, we go to my environment and I go into a SharePoint document library. So nothing particularly exciting here. I've got a document library that stores contracts. And in it, I've got whatever, eight contracts, okay? Now, the thing is, apart from the fact I can see it's a Word document, and it happens to be called by a name, the person's name, I've got very little else to go on to understand the meaning of this document. So it would be very difficult for me to apply, say, a business process around a document, or it'd be difficult for me to apply retention to the document. And it's certainly not really going to be very easy to find this document, because apart from the fact this document relates to Barbara Dias, you know, and it may have some content in it, the document isn't really classified. So this is where the wonder of metadata comes in. So these documents have all been classified. And instead of just having a simple list of 8 documents, the metadata allows me to expose information and support processes. So for instance, all of these contracts have a job ID. All of the contracts relate to a type of service. So in this case, I've grouped them by home design or home renovation. These are all service agreements. And because it's a service agreement, we have a particular retention, retention policy that's applied to them. So in this case, we keep them for 5 years. We also have a contract end date, and that contract end date might be being used to drive a separate process to, you know, maybe trigger a sales activity to extend the service or sell another service. Now, that's all standard SharePoint. And so far, you could do everything I'm showing you today without thinking about SharePoint Syntex. But the problem is, how do we get this metadata? How do we get this retention label assigned to it? How do we get the content classified? And the answer, of course, is, well, you could manually do it. So I can go to this first file. I can click the information tab. And if I'm the unfortunate user that's got to do this, I can go in and I can add in the client name. I could add in the client address. I could add in the job ID. I could add in the contract end date, the service type, and apply a label to it. And of course, I can do all of that. But the reality is doing all of that, A, takes time, and B, is prone to errors. So this is really where SharePoint Syntex comes in. Now, essentially, what happens is we have a document library, like our contracts document library, and people can upload content into that library, or you can have an automated process that just bulk uploads content into that library. When the content is uploaded, though, we have something called a SharePoint Syntex model. So think of this like being an AI process that reasons over the files that have been uploaded. And it does 3 things. The first thing it does is classifies the content. And if you come from a SharePoint background, hopefully you'll understand the concept of a content type. If you don't, it's just really a way of saying this is a services agreement, or this is an invoice, or this is a purchase order, or this is a proposal. Once we've classified the content, we can then apply labels, and labels can be either to support retention, i.e. we need to keep this content for 10 years or keep it for 20 years, and or we need to delete it after the end of the retention period. Or it could be to apply a sensitivity label, and a sensitivity label allows you to protect the document in terms of who has access to it and what they can do with it. The final thing it does is it will extract metadata from inside the document and populate that metadata to columns in your document library. And this is the bit that really is exciting, and is the bit that saves a lot of that manual effort. So let's have a look at that in action. Go back to my library. I am just going to grab a couple of documents and put them into the library. So when I drop the document into the library, this is the document I've just added. And you see it's come up with a little prompt. We're analyzing your file. One or more of the columns will be updated with discovered values. While it's doing that, let's just have a look at the file. So it's a Word document, which means it's what we call a semi-structured stroke unstructured document. Okay, the format and structure of the document could vary significantly between each different document. So we can see here, just zoom in slightly. So you can see here we've got, it's a statement of work. That's the job ID. We've got the customer name, we've got the customer address, we've got some contractual information, we've got the date the contract starts, we've got the scope of work, which is there. So we've got information in it that comprises the metadata that we want to extract. Now, it's going to take a couple of minutes to do it. So whilst it's doing it, I'm just going to go into a different library, and this one contains purchase orders. And you can see here what we're doing is we're extracting who the purchase order, the vendor it relates to, purchase order number, and some financial information. And I'm just going to drag and drop some purchase orders into here. Let's drag a few in there. So the same thing again, it's telling us it's processing them. So if we have a look at one of these purchase orders, very different document than the Word document. These are PDFs for a start, but they're very well structured. So we know that the purchase order date's there, we know the PO number's there, we know the where the the vendor information is, and we know where the totals are likely to be. So I'm hoping this has done this one. Okay, so that's the document I uploaded, and you can see here it's now extracted the client name, it's extracted the client address, it's extracted the contract end date, and because it knows it's a service agreement, it's applied a label, retention label, none of which has required me to do anything. If we go into my purchase orders, those new ones that I've uploaded, which I think are the ones down here, it's done the same thing. So it's extracted the vendor, the PO number, the subtotal, tax, all without me doing anything with the document. Now, the magic in SharePoint Syntex relates to models. And the good news is the models are relatively simple to create. And essentially, there's a couple of tasks you have to follow to create a model, but it doesn't really require a huge amount of technical expertise. So let me show you the contracts model that I have in place. So here's my model. And the 4 steps are simply upload a set of files that represent examples of the type of file that you want to classify. And you have to provide a minimum of 5. In doing that, you also need to provide some examples of files that don't represent the type of file that you're looking for. Now, once you've done that, we click Train Classifier. These are my list of sample files, okay? And what I essentially do is you step through each file and you say, is this an example of, in my case, a service agreement? Yes. Is an example? Yes. Is this an example? Now, in this case, this is my false one, so I've said no. Go to the next one. Is that an example? Yes. I'll do a couple of these. Yes, that one is. Yes, that one is, and so forth. Now, once I've done that, it tells me you've labeled a sufficient number of files, move to train, or if you'd like to continue labeling files, do so. So when I go on to train, you can see down here, it's looking back through my files and it's saying, yeah, the one that you told me is an example, I'm happy I could classify. That's essentially what it's saying. And it's done that for all of those. So that's the first part of the process. The second part of the process is if I want to extract metadata, it's slightly more complicated, but in my case, here's my metadata. I've got client, client address, job ID, so forth. So let's take client. So the principle's similar to what I've just shown you, but what I have to do to train it is I have to show syntax where the client could exist in the sample documents. Okay, so an example here, that's the client name in this first example. Next file, that's the client name in this one. Next file, that's the client name. Next file, this is one of the files that isn't an example, so it's nope, doesn't exist. That's where that one exists. That's where that one exists. Now I'll go on to one that I haven't done yet. So that's that one, and I say that's where the label exists. Okay. Now you might think this is just displaying as text. It basically extracts the text from the file you're looking at to make it easier. It is still the kind of a Word document behind the scenes, but it takes away all the formatting so that when you're highlighting things, it's easier to highlight. Okay. Now, once I've done that, same principle, I go to train. And it's going through and it's evaluating what I've told it. And hopefully it will give me a pretty good match. Now, there are cases where you have to give it more information. And I'm not really going to dive into that in any detail today, apart from to say you can add things that say what you're actually looking for is a credit card number, or what you're looking for is a date field, or what you're looking for is an email address. So there's a load of things that you can help it out by telling it you're looking for this type of content. So once we've trained our service, we're ready to go. Now, before we apply it, if we want to make use of setting a sensitivity label or setting a retention label, this is where we do it. So if I want to say every service agreement is a confidential document that needs to be kept for 7 years, then I can apply that. That's essentially what I'm doing there. And then when I apply the model, I can simply select any SharePoint document library where I want to apply the model. Behind the scenes, it'll do all the magic in terms of creating the columns, creating the content type, applying the model, doing everything I need it to do. So if I look at where I've published the models to, so here's my contracts library. When I published the model here, it added all of my columns and it added the model. So we can see here, there's the model that's been applied. You can have multiple models applied to the same library. It's not a problem. And I can actually, from the library, select to add a model if I had multiple models available. Now, in terms of files that you can process, worth mentioning, obviously Office documents, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, emails, .eml files, .msg files, PDF files, and images. Now, if you're looking to classify images, what it does behind the scenes is it OCRs the image, so it translates all the text, and then it uses the text that it translates. Okay.
James, just a question that's come direct in. If you add more files, will the training classifier results get better?
If the training classifier is having problems, more files might help, but essentially I don't display the columns, but you see there's a column down here that gives you a confidence rating. So you can see all of these are really, really high, 99.9%. However, in my model, I was messing about with it, and I've managed to reduce this part of the classifier down to 83% because I was changing some of the information.
Sure.
So adding more files, it depends how many variations of the file that you've got, to be honest. I mean, I guess it's easy to make this easy in a demo for it to seem very simple, and I don't want to kind of hide the fact that you do have to do a bit of work to get it to work. But adding sort of 50 files potentially may not make your job any easier. Actually, if you've got a small subset, what you're essentially doing is giving it clues about where to find the content. So I'll just show you an example. So if I say add an explanation, so I say find this phrase, obviously llama, I had to get a llama in the demo somewhere, and then I'm going to say find this phrase in the beginning of the file, and it will say, you know, okay, pick part of the beginning of the file that you mean, which is what this box is doing here. So I can kind of do quite a lot of work to train it even with a relatively small number of documents, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so SharePoint Syntex. Its primary purpose is to allow you to categorize content. And that means categorize it so you can apply a retention label or a sensitivity label, categorize it with metadata so you can support a business process, or categorize it so it's easier to find the document when it comes to search. And this is kind of where syntax and topics go hand in hand. They're not dependent on each other, so there's no dependency on deploying both, but they do work well together. So to give you an example, if we have a load of files that exist within a document library, and we're using SharePoint Syntex to classify those files and apply metadata, that metadata can be used to support topics, and it can be used in two ways. The first way is that metadata that we apply to files can also be used to drive the creation of topics. So let's say in your organization you have a defined set of products, and you define that set of products and you say, when we classify files that relate to a product, we're going to tag it against the product or products it relates to. And also we want to use that same list of products to drive a series of Viva Topic pages. So that is possible to do. Now, likewise, if a file is tagged with metadata, i.e. it relates to a product, then that helps the suggestions to make sure that files that relate to a particular product appear on the topic page that is to do with that product. Now I'll show you just a quick example of this. If we go to my purchase orders here, one of the bits of information that we extract from the purchase order is the vendor name. Now, in my environment, I'm creating a topic page for all of the vendors. So if I go back to my search and I do a search for Rally Cloud, here is the topic page for Rally Cloud. And if we scroll down, these are the documents that relate to Rally Cloud. If I expand out, we see also the purchase orders. And that's because the purchase order is tagged with the vendor. So the when the AI process for Viva Topics runs, it will find those files and it will suggest them against the topic page for that vendor. Okay, so I just saw a question there. Can you apply multiple models to the same library? Absolutely. And that's kind of important because the way the classification works, each model relates to a single content type in SharePoint, so purchase order or contract. Now, in my scenario, I've got a library for each type of content, but in reality, you might have a library that stores many different types of content. So what you would do is you'd have multiple models, a classifier for a service agreement, a classifier for an invoice, a classifier for a quote, and you would then publish the same model to the library. And effectively, when you drop the document into the library, the models kick off in turn. And the first model to say, I understand what this, I'm going to grab this file. This is a X file or this is a Y file. Then it'll classify it. Then it'll extract the metadata. Okay, so the thorny topic of licensing. Now, Viva Topics is fairly straightforward in this respect. All the features are covered by a single license, and any user that accesses any of those features requires a Viva Topics license. So it doesn't matter whether you're the person who's managing the AI suggested topics, or you're a person who just has view rights to topics, or you're a person who can manually add topics. It's the same license. And the license can be bought in one of two ways. It can be bought as a standalone add-on called the Viva Topics add-on, and it's a per user per month. The figure I've put here is just the kind of recommended retail from the website. So obviously check with whoever your licensed reseller what you'd pay for that. Or it can be bought as part of the Microsoft Viva suite. So this is if you also want to license users for Viva Learning or Viva Insights. Obviously Viva Connections is free, essentially if you already have SharePoint licenses. Now, you typically wouldn't license day one everyone in your organization. You typically have a very small subset of people that you'd pilot this with, and you'd want to understand how Viva Topics reasons over your content, what it's finding in terms of AI suggestions. So, arguably you can have a very small number of users licensed to do a pilot or a proof of concept. There is a limited time-limited trial available, which is also a good way of using it. But just a kind of word of warning on that, the limited time trial is 25 or 30 days, I think. It takes Viva Topics a couple of weeks to really get to grips with your content before you start getting lots and lots of AI suggested topics. So just be aware, if you do start a limited time trial, make sure you don't kind of plan your activities around the fact it will be a couple of weeks before you get a lot of information back. SharePoint Syntex licensing is rather confusing. So to try and kind of explain it, a person needs a license if they apply a model to a library. They also need a license if they upload content to a library which has a model applied. So if you want to add a model to a library that you're going to upload content to, you need a license to that. You do not need a license for the users who will be working with the files that exist in that library. Okay, so if a user just has read access to those files, they do not need a license. And also, if you're interested in trying this out, you do not need a license to build your own models. You just simply can't publish them to other SharePoint sites within your environment. So this is a great way of kind of understanding whether the models could add value to a particular scenario you've got, because you don't need a license to try it out. It is licensed on a per user per month basis. Again, this is the kind of RRP value. And for obviously the time I have available today, I've really just skimmed over some of the capabilities of SharePoint Syntex. There is a lot more to it than I've kind of alluded to. But if I'm honest, what I've covered today is probably, if I say the 101 things you need to know about it, that's it. But just to say, it does include quite a lot of additional capabilities. Now I've put a link to both of the both of the pages that talk about licensing and both of the pages that talk about the products. So obviously go and have a look at those. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions people have.
So James, I had a couple of people post questions directly to me as we went, actually about the Viva Topics part, first of all. So the first question was, when will Viva Topics integration for Teams be available?
Good question. So according to the Microsoft roadmap, the preview for Viva Topics being visible within Teams conversation apparently is March 2022, which on last checking appears to be this month, although I haven't seen the capability arrive. So if I was having to put money on this, my view would be it'll be in the next quarter. So it'll be kind of in the next 3 months, probably as a preview feature to start with. And then later for the integration with Outlook and certainly the Office applications.
Perfect. And they've put a part 2 to that question as well. Does everyone see all the topics?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. It's worth just mentioning to do with a topic. So a topic, firstly, you control the visibility of topics at different points in their lifetime. So this topic, which is a suggested topic in my environment, is visible to everyone. But you can decide that you don't want any suggested topics to be visible and that you want to have a human validate topics. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the topic itself is made up of a title, description, people, files, and SharePoint sites. Now, the topic title is visible to everyone. There is one caveat that I'm going to come back to. The topic description is visible to people who have rights to see the document where the topic description came from. Okay, so if I didn't have rights to this document, I wouldn't see the description. Obviously, if you manually add a description, it's manually there and then everyone will see it. The people will be visible. The suggested files are security trimmed based on your rights to be able to see the file. So if, as I said before, if I didn't have rights to the sales and marketing site, I wouldn't see this file. And likewise with the SharePoint sites. Now, it is entirely possible, although it's not typically recommended, to restrict access to this topic. So I could take this individual topic and I could say, I only want a subset of the organization to see this topic is there. That is possible to do, but it's typically not recommended for most scenarios. I mean, like a lot of things, as I'm sure we know, the default state when you enable SharePoint Syntex is that suggested topics are automatically visible to everyone in the organization. Topics can be created by everyone in the organization, and topics can be edited by everyone in the organization. Now, that's not to say that that default state is correct for a particular organization, but that's kind of how Microsoft pitch it.
Great. Thank you, James. I think there's just one more question coming through now. Bear with me 2 seconds. Yeah. Are there any file types that Syntex does or does not support?
Okay. So I think I mentioned this briefly before. You can add Office files, so Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can add emails. You can add PDFs, and a PDF can exist either as a text PDF, so it has a text content in it, or an image PDF, or you can add images. And if it's an image, PNG, TIFF, JPEG, I'm not sure exactly which ones are supported, Syntex will OCR the content, so it'll try and extract all the text from it and then do its classification and extracting the metadata based on that. It also will do HTML pages, although I've not really tried to do anything with HTML pages, so I just noticed that was in the list of supported file types.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, James. Does anyone have any other questions at all? You can send them direct to me or post them in the chat. I think that's everything. So, James, I just want to say thank you for that webinar. I think that was really informative. Certainly some good use cases for topics I can see for any organisation, particularly new starters coming in who may not be familiar with the terminology. And the Syntex is brilliant. I think that's going to save a lot of people a lot of time with admin headaches, although potentially that licensing could cause a few more headaches. But I'll just paste.
Well, here's one for you, Mike. So
Mm.
if after the session, just take a mental note over the next week, how often you find yourself looking for a piece of content in your organization and how long it takes you. And even if it's 5 minutes every day, that's the kind of quantification of scale across all people, across every day of the week.
Yeah, I think
That's where the business benefit comes in.
absolutely, especially with these organizations that have thousands or tens of thousands of users, that quickly adds up. So I can see some great feedback in the comments as well. Thank you everyone for that. Please do take time to fill out that feedback survey. If you do want to know more, you can arrange a one-to-one session with James via that feedback survey. Just tick the box saying you're okay for a follow-up. But I think some really good comments coming in, and lots of people found that interesting. So yeah, thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.